Alright, so this is going to be our notes on porifera or sponges. We're going to start off with the really simple organisms, and then we're going to work our way up to things like insects and arthropods and some of these organisms that are very complex. It's important before we start to remember the complexity of all living things. And really living things, the simplest things, are just made up of, let me change that color, cells, right? And then those cells work together to create tissue, right? And we talked already about germ layers, and these tissues come from that process where an embryo, certain stages develop those three germ layers. Those three germ layers form each of these tissues. Those tissues then form organs, and then organ systems, right? In this part right here, depending on the organism, this is your embryo right here, right? And then when you get to the organ part, this is the fetus, right? Okay. So you want to keep this in mind as we're going through these organisms and looking at their development or their complexity. Sponges or porifera are very basic. They're really just right here. They don't have this, and they don't have this. They just have some cells, and we can see the kind of organism they are. They're benthic, which means they live on the ocean floor. So they're not really moving around. They do have a way to reproduce and to move from where they are. We'll probably mention that here in a minute. But overall, they're benthic. They just stay attached. They have like, not really roots, but they're attached to the seafloor, and they're not moving a whole lot. Okay, so attached. Live on the bottom of the ocean floor. And again, they're the simplest invertebrates. No tissue, no organs, but again, they have these specialized cells. The way they really survive, though, is they live this simple lifestyle. They filter water. If you've ever seen, I'm trying to think, maybe not SpongeBob isn't a great example, I won't use him, but these guys just suck in water, and then they absorb nutrients and the things that they need, oxygen and such, from the water. So they get the oxygen for respiration from the water that they pass through themselves. They get rid of waste through this process, and they get their nutrients by absorbing. And these two right here, this is just absorption. So they're not like, they don't have a mouth or anything. They just diffuse it across their cell membranes. So diffusion, remember we talked about that. You know, particles going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So the cell or the sponge in its cells has a low concentration of oxygen. The water passing over it has a higher concentration, so just naturally through nature, the oxygen is diffused across the cell membranes, and the sponge uses it to stay alive. Same thing with food. So there's some specialized cells that we're talking about, and the one we really want to talk about is collar cells. But before we do that, I want to show you a picture here of what these things look like. Got a couple for you. So if we were going to look at, we'll start right here. So here's a picture of a sponge. Now they're different shapes. This is more like a cylinder type sponge, but you can see they have these different types of cells. One is a porocyte, so that's a cell that's made up of the pore, and the water kind of just flows in through. And you can see these arrows, it's showing how the water is pulled in through. And then you have these mesophyll, that's kind of like the general body of the cell. There's amoebocytes. So amoebocytes can help digest food. They can help form the other types of cells that are there. They're kind of like universal. And then choanocyte, or this is this cell that attaches to this flagella here, and these flagella actually like move back and forth, and that causes the flow of water. So we have these pores here, and then we have these little flagella here. They move back and forth. That causes a water path of water to start flowing, water to flow, because of those flagella. And then when that happens, pressure changes, it pulls water in, and whatever the water has, oxygen, food, those are then absorbed through the cells here, the amoebocytes, and these amoebocytes also get rid of waste as well. So that's kind of the basic sponge. If we were going to look at a more detailed part of this, so here we have, there's some other parts, these spicules. These are like these spikes that these sponges develop that helps make them very unattractive for things to eat, because who wants to eat something with a bunch of needles in it? Okay. Some of these words we're not going to worry as much about, but here is an archaeocyte. An archaeocyte is actually, I mentioned amoebocyte before, but it really is actually wrong. The archaeocyte is the one that can develop into any of these other cells. Okay, and then you also see here, if we look at this side view, this is the flagellum. This moves back and forth. These all move in unison, and that pulls the water in. Here's this porocyte, this cell right here, that allows the water to flow in just through an opening. Okay, and then we have this choanocyte here, and it has a collar on it with the flagella. So many people call this a collar cell, and that allows the water to move throughout the sponge. Okay, and this is kind of the outside of the sponge. So this thing's sitting in the water and pulls water in. The water flows by. These cells help absorb food and oxygen and whatever else it needs, and that just helps the sponge have this basic existence. So yeah, there's some pinocytes. This is this outer cell that makes up the external of the sponge. And then they sometimes call this opening, this pore, an ostium and a canal. And also this top of the cell, we'll look at it in a minute though. Okay, so that's kind of the cells. So we have this archaeocyte. This can become anything. This is your collar cell or choanocyte, and your collar and your flagellum. And then you have these porocytes right here, these pore cells that allow water to come in. So if we go back to our notes, okay, we'll go back to here. And so collar cells, so we'll get rid of these annotations. And we'll go down. Okay, and these are probably the most important cells in the sponge, because they produce the movement of water that allows it to bring nutrients in and bring oxygen in. Okay, and those are those special cells we saw there. If we go back to it, this is this collar cell, and we see here that they have the flagella on them. So just a collar cell or choanocyte plus a collar on it. Kind of looks like this. Just draw a picture. Embedded in the body of the, then it has a little collar and a flagella. Then there's a bunch of these lined up, and they just move back and forth and cause the water to move. Okay, but also important is here are spicules and spongin. Spicules, remember, there's these little pointy things are just embedded all throughout the sponge, and they help protect it from predators. Some are able to eat them, some are not. Okay, and they also live in the deep ocean. This structure, because you think about what it takes to live at the bottom of the ocean, you have this giant water column on top of you and pushing down, so you have to have this really rigid structure that allows you to stand the pressure. These spicules and also this material spongin, which is really tough, helps the sponge live at those deep regions of the ocean and not be flattened out, but actually be a rigid organism that can allow water to flow through it. Okay. The symmetry they have is they have no symmetry. They're asymmetrical. So if you cut a piece off, there really is no central region or radial symmetry. You can't cut it in half and have two equal parts. And these guys are also, what's interesting is they're also can be plankton. Okay, so plankton is just any organism that is carried along by the currents in the ocean. So they don't have the ability to move themselves, but then they depend on the ocean currents to carry them. Well, to reproduce, they can produce larvae or sperm and egg, and then those then they produce a larva from that, and then these can get carried somewhere else. So they have the movement option that all animals have, and that occurs after they're fertilized, when they become a zygote and go through that process. And then if we look at reproduction, there's two possibilities here. Because these guys are so simple, they can reproduce asexually, so they can break a piece off and form another sponge. Okay. What's kind of interesting, you could actually take a blender. Let's put a little lid on this guy. So if we took SpongeBob, see if I can draw him. It's not a very good drawing, is it? So if this was SpongeBob, doesn't look very good, does it? Starting to look like him a little bit. So if we took him, put him in the blender, okay, and ground him up. You can do this with sponges, and then place that back in the water. New sponges would form. That's the asexual reproduction. So it can repair itself, or it can produce new sponges from pieces of itself. Okay, so if you've ever watched SpongeBob, the cartoon, when that happens, and he gets cut up by something running through a fence or something happens, then you have a whole bunch of SpongeBobs. That's actually based on truth, because they are asexual. They can break pieces off and produce new ones. So if we took SpongeBob and we cut him like this, like this, like this, like this, like this, like this, each one of these pieces would be a new SpongeBob. But also they can produce sexually, which means they produce gametes, a sperm and an egg, and they can unite to form a zygote and form a new organism. And so they have those options. Sometimes this is a little bit more, takes a little bit more energy and maybe not needed. So if they're living in colonies, they can produce a new sponge just like itself. It wouldn't really matter. But also it's good to have the ability to, you know, increase your DNA possibilities, your traits. Then you can produce sexually, where you would produce a sperm and an egg, and the water would carry that, and then different sponges would produce offspring that are slightly different. These also produce something called gemmules, and these gemmules are like a coating or a covering. So these sponges can produce these almost like a seed, and they're really resistant. So if conditions aren't right, and there isn't really, it doesn't make sense to reproduce, but maybe if the sponge died, that would die off, there'd be no more sponges. So this gemmule is left, and then when the conditions are right, and you know, it could produce a new sponge then. If you remember, we watched the video on the fairy shrimp in the desert that only produce when there's a certain amount of water. Kind of the same thing. This might produce a gemmule, a little covering or a coating, and then when conditions are just right, it would then start to develop. So that's kind of a rough and thing view of the Porifera. Hopefully that gives you a good start. Let me erase these things here. And we're going to do a reading on this too, so it'll probably help you understand a little bit better. And let me know if you have any questions, and that's it. That's your notes. Make sure you annotate these and turn them into me.